All right.
Okay, so we're on to the last two units. So we'll start with Thatcher and then we'll do international relations. So obviously, we talked about the post-war consensus before and of like nationalization, of accepting the trade unions, Keynesian economics, high tax and spend, and the welfare state. And basically, that's been going on from Attlee until 79. And he attempts to overthrow it, but basically backs down when unemployment gets too high. And now we get to Thatcher, who basically is massively important, whether you like her or dislike her as a prime minister, because she basically transforms how the entire system of the UK breaks the post-war consensus into what we live in now, which is basically like the Thatcherite consensus. So we were living in Attlee's world, we're now living in Thatcher's world. Um, and the first question that can come up is like, why did Thatcher win three elections in a row? So they can kind of do the elections individually. So the 79 election, I don't think they do 83, 87. They tend to only do elections when a government changes. So why did she win three elections in a row? We can look at the 79 election first. So obviously, in terms of the Conservative strength, she was the first female prime minister. So for any government, that in itself can be a weakness as well, because people had never seen a female leader, and she was one of the first female leaders. I think was she the first female leader of a major country? I think she was. Um, but
I
certainly, it
think
was
so.
something new for the UK. And she was coming with fresh economic ideas, the idea of monetarism, although this was building on Heath. So like Heath had intended to implement a lot of the things she wanted to bring in economically. We'll talk about that in the economics later, essay later. But she was determined to change it. She'd seen Heath back down, she'd seen him lose, she'd seen Labour continue to fail to deal with the economic situation. And she herself was seen as a strong leader. And what's often cited is the effective posters and campaigns, like the Labour's not working poster is highly is really famous. Although none of my students did this for coursework last year, and they were arguing that a lot of the effective posters and campaigns were kind of overdone, that their exposure to the public in general was not as high, like the Saatchi poster campaign and stuff. So um, I think the country was ready for a change in 79. I think they'd had enough and they were looking for something a bit different because the continuation of this post-war consensus was just not an option. And the danger on Labour was that they were giving more and more ground to the trade unions, so the country was dysfunctional. And that leads into the kind of Labour weaknesses in 79 because you had the winter discontent. So obviously you had bodies piling up because the grave diggers were not burying them. You had piles of rubbish all over the city because the bin men were not collecting any rubbish. You had large numbers of unions going on strike for wages. Callahan was perceived as a weak leader. He'd gone off to the Caribbean, came back, and obviously that famous Sun headline, "Crisis, what crisis?" Because he was not really in a crisis. So, I mean, there was also the incident that Callahan is often cited as calling the election too late, because if he'd have called it in 78, then they may have won it. Because he had the option to call it before the winter of discontent when Labour were ahead in the polls, because that just still wasn't fully trusted. There's still a lot of, it's 79, there's going to be a lot of sexism, voters that are unlikely to vote for a woman. You can still see that in America today. And that, but Callahan had failed to deal with the trade unions. It's not that that was anything new. It was building on the fact that his um, pact with the trade unions had failed in the same way that the Industrial Relations Act had failed under Heath, in the same way in place of strife had failed under Wilson. None of these prime ministers have been able to get hold of the trade unions. The economy was still problematic, high inflation, like stagnation, but all of these were basically legacies of Keynesian economics. It was going to be difficult to get rid of it. And basically, it was just more of the same that wasn't really working. And then he, for some reason, dissolves his own pact with the Liberal Party. It's not really clear why, and that obviously leaves him in trouble. And then he has to rely on the Nationalist Party votes, and he fails to get them devolution, which is something that Blair then eventually follows up for the Labour Party in '97. But that leads to effectively the Nationalist Party's abandoning him, and Thatcher calls a vote of no confidence and takes him down, which is the last time a government was brought down by a vote of no confidence. So would you say it was more Labour weakness or more Conservative strength?
Mm, Probably Labour weakness.
Yeah.
I think I'll probably take that position.
Mhm. And
Um, yes, I think you still have a divided Labour Party, and as you say,
yeah,
the um, high inflation, bad economy, and trade union issues.
Yeah.
Um, that's a bad combination, bad hand to play. I think. But then again, Thatcher wasn't particularly well known, was she? And she didn't seem to have significant support in her own party either.
There was skepticism, I
Uh,
think, because she's a woman. I think there was that, and
right.
and
But
she
there's
sort of
also the
backstabbed Heath as well. Yeah.
But there's also the problem. There's also the problem that there are conservatives who are still consensus conservatives,
Oh
right?
yeah, she has that all the way
So
through her first term. They were the wets in her
yeah,
cabinet. Yeah.
right, exactly. Okay, so
Yeah, she has to balance the Conservative Party because she can't really make a purge of the party. She doesn't make a purge till after the 83 election. I think she doesn't really hit her stride till after 83 because she's still, she's still got to deal with that side. It hasn't been proven that what she's going to do works. She hasn't won another election yet, so it's
yeah,
something new.
yeah,
Um, how could they? I mean, they'd seen Heath U-turn on these policies earlier, so I think it's like again, it's one of those kind of to put it on Thatcher being the strong leader in that is kind of again that revisionist view of history. You know what she became, so therefore you
yes, that's
assume
right,
everyone saw
exactly,
that at the time.
exactly. Yeah, it's easy to read. It's a called teleological
Yeah,
approach to history, where you start with the finish, and then you try to predict you anticipate it in the beginning, but that's misleading, a misleading approach, I think.
yeah. I think the public was generally suspicious of her, and she probably would have lost in '83 without the Falklands War as well. I mean, you never know. The Labour Party was so awful in '83, but like
Yeah,
it's hard to know. Certainly, if Labour had you know, if the Falklands War hadn't happened and Labour hadn't picked someone from the ultra left of their party, I think they could have won in '83 because it took a while for her policies to come in. I mean, Thatcher obviously did say that most politicians, most prime ministers make the mistake of leaving the difficult things to last. And she was always like, you should do the most difficult decision first. And then
right,
hopefully by the next election, the public can see, the gains or the benefits of that policies as it's going through. So I
right.
would say in 79, yeah, it was probably Labour weakness that was the main driving force because it basically was just like Callahan couldn't get a grip on the country. I mean, but in a way, it's almost like the underlying fundamental weakness of the post-war consensus because it's just a continuation of that.
Indeed.
There hasn't
Yeah,
been a government that had really got a grip on UK, certainly not economically since Macmillan. And you could argue Macmillan only had it because he got lucky because of the macro boom economically. So really, you could argue that no one had run the economy well for Britain for a long time.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
there was clear room for improvement in there. And the fact that I think the country really had a choice. I mean, if they went Labour, they were going, Foot and Michael Benn at this point, they had gained a lot of ground. Tony Benn, sorry, had gained a lot of ground on the in the Labour Party. And it was kind of a choice between going to more of the unions or basically trying something different. And I think the
yeah,
public had had enough, basically.
yeah. Okay,
It's not like she wins by much. But then I think the 83 election's different because,
that's the Falk. I mean, that's strongly influenced by the Falklands, right?
yeah, I think so. I mean, you got both things. Like, she hadn't really, most of her most famous policies, like the council house sell-off and like giving shares from the Big Bang in the city, none of them had really kicked in by 83. She was still kind of battling to get her policies through. She still had
Yeah,
a lot of resistance from the Wets, from the what we call One Nation Tory, like
yeah,
old school post-war consensus conservatives in her cabinet in the first period. Like things weren't really working. They didn't initially get a grip on inflation, and the economy was struggling a little bit because obviously you get a lot of pain in an economic transformation before you get any gain from it.
yeah,
And the big thing there was like she was heading towards a defeat, I think, in 83, or at least she was looking weak in the polls. And that's despite Labour being really weak at this point, because you've got the split of the alliance leaving and forming the SDP, Social Democratic Party. So this includes like Roy Jenkins and a lot of big Labour politicians. So obviously Roy Jenkins had been like the main uh, driving force behind all the social policies under Wilson. So, this is a big group of political beasts that separate off. David Owen, Bill Rogers, and Shirley Williams. So all of these four are what you would call big beasts in the Labour Party and like major centrists. And they no longer identify with the parties. If you're making a analogy with like modern times, that would be like when Corbyn had control of the Labour Party, if all of the main moderates of Labour had left. And they considered it, but they saw
Mm.
what happened in 83 and knew that it was really damaging. So the SDP split off, and obviously they're going to take all of the moderate Labour vote. Eventually, the SDP and the liberals would form the Liberal Democrats and move together. But initially, they were running as different parties. You now have three parties on the left because you have the SDP, Labour, and the Liberals, which is a big problem because it splits the left-wing vote. So between them, they actually get more votes than Thatcher in both the elections, but not enough. The left being divided is a problem, and the rights had that advantage of being united behind one party until UKIP and then Reform have come in.
Okay.
Um, Michael Foot is the leader, so it's a full-on drift to the full left wing of the party, and drifts so far to the left that, like I said, the moderate part of the Labour Party splits off, which is a problem. He was unable to hold the party together, and like the manifesto of the Labour Party in 1933 is known as the longest suicide note in history.
I think that's a fantastic name.
Yeah, argues for full nationalization, universal nuclear disarmament, government regulation. So
Wow.
basically, it doubles down on
Yeah.
let's go back to an even more extreme version. It was like the left wing of Labour's version of the post-war consensus.
Yeah.
The
I mean,
reach of it.
yeah, that's a hard thing for a political party to cope with when they experience defeat is whether to double down or
Yeah,
to go towards the center, right?
yeah. Usually in
So,
English politics, I think they double down, get absolutely thumped, and then go to the centre. That generally tends to be how it happens, which is why
right,
every major party gets at least 2 wins usually.
right.
And then the party in power goes the other way because they win one, they win a second one, they start to get overconfident and they think they can drift to their wing and win from their wing.
Yeah, yeah,
That's why we tend to have circular politics in the UK, I think, from that. And so a vital factor in that 93 election is the SDP vote. The SDP
the
vote
83.
makes the
Sorry,
difference. Oh, sorry? Hmm?
yeah, I think you said 93.
Oh, did I say 83 election? The
That's it.
SDP vote makes a difference in
Yeah,
that. But obviously,
yeah,
on the conservative strength side, I think the Falklands War is massively important.
yeah. I think for 83, I would argue probably conservative. I'd argue Labour weakness in 79 and probably conservative strength in 83, just as a result of Falklands. This
Yeah,
is very, very good timing for Thatcher. I
yeah, yeah.
mean,
She was struggling in the
it's
polls, and then Argentina obviously underestimated her by invading
it's
into.
hard to appreciate the extent to which luck has a hand in these affairs, right?
Yeah,
You can be really unlucky. You could have like a run on the stock market, for example, just before your election. But
yeah,
then you can you can have a international crisis and do very well out of it, like
yeah.
before Quince. So
Well, look at Mark Carney in Canada now.
indeed,
He might win
absolutely,
because
yeah,
Poilievre is associated with Trump. So the
exactly,
Canadians are not happy.
exactly, yeah, yeah.
And Poilievre was what, 20 points ahead until Trump got elected? It's been eroded.
Yeah, 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 it's crazy. Yeah, well, with all of this, anyway, let's
Yeah.
avoid the
Yeah, so like
too much
the Falklands War
contemporary
obviously comes in.
things.
The
So
country's going to rally behind a wartime leader. They win the war, so it's really a prestigious, and we'll talk about it more in international relations. It's kind of a
yes,
regaining of international prestige for the British.
yeah, yeah,
Because, they haven't really been involved in any major international crisis since Suez, so that's like still the tainted
yeah.
mouth of the British national military, and so the
It's
Falklands
a
easy win.
would this analogy work? You know when you support a football team
Yeah,
that keeps losing,
yeah,
and then they have like a kind of moderate victory, and everyone goes crazy
yeah,
because they just haven't won for so long.
yeah,
Something like
yeah.
that.
I think so, and I think
Something
that
like that.
you always get jingoistic nationalist supporters coming out in the war. Generally in wartime, people rally behind the prime minister or the president.
Yeah,
Um,
and
Usually, and she gets the win, it boosts the
yeah,
morale. I'm still not sure. I think you could argue either one for conservative strength or Labour weakness for this election because Labour are really weak. I mean, you don't
yeah.
get weaker than your party splitting in two.
No, that's not great, is it?
No, and it's like, and I think, and I suppose the way you could look at it is if you add up the Liberal, Labour, and SDP votes, they win.
Yeah.
So was the conservative? Well, I mean, Thatcher never got the percent, you know what I mean? But this country, I think in general, has always been had a higher percentage vote on the left. It's just that it's always been split, whereas on the right, it's been united. And I think that's what you're going to see. That's why the Conservatives got thumped in this recent election because it's now split on the right as well.
Yeah.
I think you can make the case for either one in this one. I think I would vote. I think perception-wise, it's at the Falklands War one and the Conservatives one, but I really think that split, Foot's leadership to, the Labour Party's always been divided, but it hadn't actually literally divided until just before this election. And I think that
Okay. So you could go either way on it.
I think
I
so. I
think.
think you could go either way on Conservative strength for Labour weakness for this one. And
What
then
about 87?
87, I think, is a closer to a conservative strength because by this point, Thatcher's building her momentum, and like most of her real big, what I would call domestic policy successes, happened between the 83 and the 87 election, and then after the 87 elections, when the power goes a bit to her head, and we'll look at when she loses power in 1990, she sort of drifts off. But
Yeah.
in this one, I'll deal with the Labour weaknesses first. So the same weaknesses as 83, really. The party is still divided. So the SDP, Liberal, and Labour are still splitting the vote on the left. So that's still a
Yeah.
problem. So that fundamental Labour weakness is still there, that division that's led into a full-on split. The alliance contested every seat in 1987, the alliance between the SDP and Liberals. And that causes further weakness for the Labour Party because they hadn't been able to compete for all of them before, but now they were able to. But on the flip side, they got Kinnock now as leader. So Kinnock had managed to pull the party a bit more back to the centre, but he himself lacked that kind of personal appeal. But he started the kind of bringing Labour back to the centre that's continued by Smith before he dies, and then eventually finalised by Blair, obviously, when he takes it in the 97 election. But I mean, in the end, Labour end up out of power for like 18 years. I think Labour is more viable under Kinnock than they were under Foot. So,
Yeah.
as in like under Foot, they were never going to win. I don't see Foot winning an election. You know what I mean? I think it's just a bit like Corbyn. It was always going to be difficult to win. He's not really viable. But Kinnock was a viable
Yeah.
prime minister. I just think he was up against the Conservative Party that had got momentum. Thatcher's economic policies had kicked in the 80s. Now, there's a big disagreement about whether it was her economic policies, whether she got lucky again from like a macro economy, whether it was just the pumping, the North Sea oil as a boom, or whether it was just the money they were making from constantly selling off absolutely everything for privatization, which made loads of money until they had nothing left to sell. But either way, the macroeconomic situation in Britain was better in the mid 80s.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that she compounds that. She's seen as a strong leader by now. This is her third election she's contesting. She's won the Falklands War. At this point, she's broken the unions. So, and that I think cannot be underestimated. She faced down the miners' union. She won.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think that's one of the most famous kind of memories, isn't it, of the Thatcher era?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important because it's like her winning that is, you know, she's basically showing the strength that Callaghan, Heath, and Wilson hadn't shown in
Yeah.
the earlier period. She starts selling off council houses, which my aunt bought her council house from
I was
these.
going to ask whether you have any relatives that benefited from this policy.
Yeah, yeah. My dad worked in banks. They bought theirs just normally, but my aunt definitely bought her council house based off Thatcher's policy. She wouldn't have been
Right.
able to otherwise. And like if you think my grandparents, my Irish said they lived in the Tower Block council estates in Ealing, and they never had the money nor the ability to buy their own house. But my aunt
Yeah.
did, and that you can
Wow.
see the
Okay.
difference in the economic position that came out of the council. So yeah, my family's working class, so they benefited from this. Like it was the aspirational working class you wanted, i.e., that the ones who would save money. So those who saved benefited, and those who spent money didn't. So it was kind of like, I mean, slightly a value judgment, but also like that to benefit what she called the aspirational working classes. And also
Yeah.
shares and definitely my family benefited from being able to buy shares in private industries
Right.
as
So that's
well.
during the privatization.
Yeah, through privatization. So they bought quite a few shares, and then my uncle, I think my dad's side has quite a few from that. So yeah, I mean these really did benefit families at the same time as obviously then reducing the council house stock, which has caused problems today. But these are long term. You know what I mean? That's not going to be noticeable in 87. So the problem with Thatcher is a lot of the tail end of what the legacy comes in afterwards is problematic. But
Yeah,
certainly in the
yeah,
short term of what's actually happening at that moment, I don't think anyone's going to be, you know, you don't notice the lack of housing stock until much later, but you do notice the fact you bought your house. And
yes,
also
yeah,
to be honest, the lack of housing stock is probably affecting Labour voters. So in a tactical thing, the Conservatives probably wouldn't mind anyway. It's about peeling off enough votes from the working class to get over the line. Middle class are better off in general. Pound is strong, which, you know, in contrast with Labour's devaluation of the pound. Unemployment's falling, starts falling, which is quite impressive considering like monetarism relies on high unemployment. And like I said, Thatcher's seen as a strong leader. So I think by now, a lot of her policies are benefiting a lot of people. Not everyone, there's still a large left-wing vote, but I think that she's done enough. I think the 87 election was pretty much voted for, but because people were happy with where the country was going.
yeah.
So
Okay.
I think the 87 election is more conservative strength.
Conservative strength.
Yeah. What do
Hmm.
you think?
I'd agree.
Yeah. So
I'd
yeah,
agree.
so if that's why did she win three elections in a row? I think at the beginning it was mostly Labour weakness, then kind of a bit in the middle between Falklands War. And you could argue Falklands War, was it really Conservative strength or just luck? But by 87, I think most of the things she's most famous for and the things that she did for the macroeconomic benefits of the country have kicked in by 87. So we would agree there that probably 79 Labour, 83 you go either way, 87 predominantly Conservative. But again, you can always argue whatever the hell you like. There's no real
Yes, as long as you cite evidence,
yeah, yeah. I would
that's
say to
what
my
matters.
students, there's no such thing as a wrong answer, just
A
poor.
badly, yeah, badly likely one. Okay.
Yeah, so you go on. Yep.
Yeah.
Did you want
Well,
to?
maybe we should end this segment now, since
Okay.
we've only got a few minutes, and then we can continue with the next
Oh, yeah.
question.
Yeah. Yeah.